I'm Joseph Clarkson. I'm a postdoctoral teaching scholar in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to talk about my article, The Rousseauian Roots of Neorealism, which is forthcoming at the Review of International Studies. So this article is basically arguing against the conventional wisdom that neorealism is basically a Hobbesian theory of international relations, that state of nature that Hobbes describes in chapter 13 of the Leviathan can just more or less be applied by analogy to the international system, and that states in the international system are much like individuals in the state of nature, according to Hobbes. So against this conventional wisdom, which I see in articles by folks like Jack Donnelly, The Discourse of Anarchy in IR, or in Annette Freiberg-Anand's book, What Moves Man, on sort of realist theories of international relations and human nature, or David Polanski's article, Drawing Out the Leviathan from 2016. This kind of narrative that Kenneth Waltz, or his theory that he founds, the theory of structural realism or neorealism, is basically a Hobbesian approach to politics, a Hobbesian political theory. So I'm arguing against this conventional wisdom that Waltz actually buys Jean-Jacques Rousseau's critique of Hobbes, and that he remains basically a Rousseauian throughout his life. That beyond his early work in his dissertation and in Man, the State, and War, all the way basically up until the end of his career, he continued to espouse Rousseau's critique of Hobbes. So I see myself in dialogue there, but also against sort of pushing back against even the tendencies of some prominent neorealists, such as John Mearsheimer, who, in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, has this footnote where he says, if you want to see how my theory can be applied to individuals, read Thomas Hobbes, The Leviathan, right? And that's going to show you how to do that. So I'm pushing back even against the self-understanding of some neorealists and saying the theory really owes more to Rousseau than it does to Hobbes. And so basically, I do this in a few parts. First, I do a kind of genealogical, historical bit of work, recovering Waltz's reading of Rousseau, trying to see, how was it that Kenneth Waltz was reading the Second Discourse in particular to explain the origins of conflict. There are certain people like Michael Williams who have criticized Waltz's emphasis on the stag hunt as sort of, missing the point of what Rousseau was doing. But I try to defend Waltz's reading and say that this actually is a pretty sophisticated understanding of Rousseau, that he is onto something, even though maybe he takes that one example, the stag hunt, and makes a lot of it. There are other places in Rousseau's writings where we can see a similar lesson being carried out. And so Waltz is really on more solid ground than what he's been given credit for. Of course, this raises the question of whether Waltz continues to be influenced by Rousseau beyond those early writings in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so in the second part of the paper, I look at basically the mature Waltz, at his theory of international politics in particular. And there I show that actually, as late as 1990, he is going to criticize Thomas Hobbes. He says, Hobbes is correct in sort of seeing that conflict is situationally explained some of the time, but he errs in thinking that even in the absence of situational constraints or in the absence of anarchy, the war of all against all would continue. And that's a pretty bold claim to say that Hobbes is erring in seeing this, right? So and so I show how this criticism of Hobbes that he's making, which goes back to Hobbes's theory of the passions, is actually based on Rousseau's critique of Hobbes. I also am in dialogue with a couple of contemporary scholars, such as Paul Viotti, who wrote an intellectual biography of Kenneth Waltz and published it this last year, as well as Alex Pritchard, who wrote an article called Kenneth Waltz's Kantian Moral Philosophy, The Virtues of Anarchy Reconsidered, in 2024. And I'm trying to show that, Waltz is also not a Kantian. When it comes to his key concept of structure, at least, he follows Rousseau's positional account of structure rather than Kant's transformational concept of structure. Essentially, for Kant, anarchy sows the seeds of its own destructions and kind of creates a pacific tendency in world history, whereas for Rousseau, structure is really about the juxtaposition of units. So, for instance, when he's explaining the deep origins of conflict, he's imagining people dispersed and then these natural catastrophes like earthquakes or floods pushing them together. And that then generates the interaction under anarchy that leads to the dynamics that someone like Hobbes would explore. But more fundamentally, humankind is peaceful. So then I look at this and show that in Waltz, there's a kind of first image reversed that he takes from Rousseau, that basically structure is determining the motives of agents through something like the sameness effect, uh, not so much vice versa, that in anarchy, security is the highest end. And this then leads to a number of takeaways for subsequent neorealist theories. So one is I see the spirals of security competition that are described by the security dilemma as basically tragedies of innocent suffering, to borrow a phrase from Catherine Liu. Also, this explains how the security dilemma is a moral dilemma, right? So what's the dilemma in the security dilemma? Uh, when John Hertz first coined it, he coined it as the dilemma of kill or be killed. And that this was a dilemma, it stemmed from the fact that he saw humans as having two motives, pity and self-preservation. So pity says, don't kill, right? Be killed, whereas self-preservation says kill, don't be killed. And so we have moral reasons for choosing both of these horns of the dilemma. And then, of course, returning to Rousseau really sheds light on the logic of the security dilemma itself. In particular, it shows that this uncertainty about others' intentions and about the future is not innate to us, but it's a social condition that really only emerges once we acquire language, which, of course, is a social construct. So these are some of the takeaways that I see from returning to the Rousseauian roots of neorealism. Thank you.